Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, owner of the company Horns of Odin. So before we start the show, I do have a little announcement to make. We recently ran a poll on our Instagram and our Discord server as to what day people would like us to record the episode on. At the moment, we do it on a Tuesday, 7 p.m. And we got an overwhelming reaction for us to swap it to a Sunday evening, same sort of time, 7 p.m. UK time. So we're going to do that probably in the new year, starting January. And it's going to give people a greater chance to join and watch live, I think. We struggle finding a timing that suited our wide range of listeners from the USA to the UK to obviously mainland Europe. So I think this Sunday is going to work. It helps people who are working during the week. And alongside that, we're also looking at moving our story time episode that we do for Patreon from the higher tier down to the basic tier, which is also going to help people get greater access to the things we do. So we're going to make that a little bit more accessible. It's going to drop down into the £3 tier. So you're going to get 2 extra episodes in that tier. So if you can, and you do want to support the show, if you enjoy what we do and want to help us keep things going, if you could pop over to Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast. There are, for £3 a month, it works out 10p a day. I think that tier is going to become pretty stacked. You're going to get the Q&A episode with every guest, which is always a lot of fun. There's a bunch of questions that I miss. I know last week with Anders Winroth, there were some questions that were just fantastic that made me feel stupid that I missed them in the main show. You're going to get, as I said, we're going to add that storytime episode in there. You get access to watch the shows live, which are always a lot of fun, especially as we get more people coming in. There's a whole side chat going on amongst the main show. You get the Discord server, you get early access. It really is going to be stacked in there. We're going to add a couple of other things into the higher tier as well. Just give it a little bit of a jiggle about. That's enough from me. I've been really looking forward to this episode since I saw that Bob booked it. So I'm going to welcome Zachary Melton to the show. Did I pronounce that right?
That's right. Yeah.
I didn't check for once.
Yeah.
I always check beforehand. I was like, I know this one. I've definitely got it. And then as soon as I said it, I was like, oh shit, maybe it's got a different saying or pronunciation.
No, that's good. You can call me Zach. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming. So do you want to give people a little rundown on kind of what we're going to cover, who you are, what you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm originally from a small town in Indiana, and I moved out to Iceland in 2015 to do the Viking and Medieval Norse master's program at the University of Iceland. Graduated there in 2017 and went straight into a PhD program in comparative literature. And I finished I defended my thesis in January of this year. So my dissertation was called An Excuse for Violence, something like gender, masculinity, and race in U.S. popular culture. And, studying sort of the idea of race and masculinity throughout the 19th and 20th century and into the 21st century, and how those factor into the image of the Viking. And now I'm doing a postdoctoral research thing at the Árnastofnun, the Árni Magnússon Institute here in Reykjavik, and I'm researching women travel writers who came to Iceland and then wrote about their experiences in the 19th and early 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. The title alone of that sounds like it's very much, I don't know, powder keg or whatever you want to describe it. It's very, I don't like the word triggering, but it's that kind of thing that's going to get emotions going high, I imagine.
It's a tough subject, and it's one that I actually struggled with. Am I the right type of person to be talking about this as a white cis male? Is that my role? And with the encouragement of my supervisors, I went ahead and you know, also, a lot of Viking fiction or adventure novels were written by middle class white American males for middle class white American males, which happens to
Mm-hmm.
be what I am. And so I thought, well, I kind of fit the profile for who they're writing for. So it was interesting, but yeah, it was tough to, you have to tiptoe around some things, and especially I didn't really know much about gender studies, and having to learn a lot and figure out the correct terminologies for things was also a challenge, and something I hope I did well in my dissertation.
Mm-hmm. So, where did it start? 'Cause you were about to tell me before the show, and I quickly put a pin in it.
Yeah. But I worked for my master's thesis. I worked with sort of the American reception in 19th century, and was looking at how Norse ideas and mythology and the Vikings sort of factored into some political discourses of the 19th century in the United States, particularly the suffrage movement um, and the slavery uh, uh, discourse. Um, and when I finished, I felt like there were some things that I hadn't really resolved yet that I wanted to look into more. And I started my PhD program in August of 2017. And that's when the march in Charlottesville occurred, if people remember that. And it sort of exploded in the field of medieval studies to see a lot of the symbols there. And so this is where this kind of started. I just wanted to sort of answer the question of how did this relationship between Old Norse or Vikings, or whatever, and racism, white supremacy, whatever we saw there, this violence. How did that sort of begin, and how did it evolve? How did it change over time? And so that's what I've tried to look at through, specifically in the realm of popular culture, because I felt like most of the people carrying tiki torches there were not reading scholarship,
Yeah.
but probably watching films and reading books and getting inspired in different ways. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It is a fascinating one because I mean, I don't roll in those circles, so I can't speak for those kind of people in the UK. But I feel like our far right white supremacist groups tend to they're more like I guess they seem more football hooligan based and
Hmm.
around that kind of area. Now I'm not saying all football hooligans are white supremacists, but they do tend to have that kind of look or seem to hang in those circles. Whereas in the US, it does seem very much attached to more like Viking style imagery, symbols, and I've always wondered why that is. And I'm sure there's plenty of white supremacists in Europe and in the UK who also use a lot of the Viking imagery and symbols. But as an outsider, it does seem very prevalent as a USA thing.
Yeah. There was a book written about 20 years ago called Gods of the Blood by Matthias Gardell, where he sort of, it's a bit outdated now, but he was researching sort of the far right mixing with, Old Norse pagan stuff. And he used this term of a smorgasbord, and sort of these extremist groups sort of just picking and choosing what they want. So
Mm-hmm.
in many corners, it feels like there's really no meaning behind, what you see. It's just a cool symbol that's been adopted for one reason or another. You were talking about this horror film, with someone had a tattoo or something where it's just sort of part of that image now, which is unfortunate. And
Yeah, just to clear that up for people who obviously people who weren't there before the show. I watched a movie called Becky the other night. Some people may have seen it. I think it's on Shudder. I'm pretty sure it's got Kevin James in it. And he's a white supremacist in that, and he's got a big swastika on the back of his head, the black sun, the SS symbols, and he's got his little crew of neo-Nazis, white supremacists, whatever you want to call them. And they're looking for this key that's got a Valknut symbol on it, and they've all got it tattooed on the back of their hand. And it's very, they never really goes into what this key does or what the symbol means to them, but it's obviously got a clear link to these white supremacists and this symbol. There's some attachment there. And watching it, it's so frustrating because anybody who knows anything about the symbol knows we know pretty much fuck all about the symbol. It appears in a few different places, and that's about all we know. But to the average Joe, anybody who doesn't, I would imagine 0.0001% of people know that this symbol actually means very little. The rest of people just see the symbol on a film associated with white supremacists, this alongside the swastika, alongside the black sun, and just assume that it's the symbol in the same light as those, and the same with when you see people storming the Capitol or doing whatever these people like to do. And it is very frustrating to see.
Yeah, and I heard a story some years ago that at a academic conference, some people were selling some pendants of Thor's hammer, and they were asked to cease that because of the association, which is, of course, not the association, but it's become so closely associated with some negative stuff that I was in Scotland not too long ago, and the Uber driver had some tattoos, and I have to do a double take, and just like there's that moment of hesitation, like, oh, is this guy cool or not? And you want to give everybody the benefit of the doubt, but it's just intriguing to look into, aside from the pagan stuff, just the Viking image in general, and how it's become sort of tossed back and forth and associated with these types of things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Before we get kind of deep into that and where it all started, I think the Viking image, as I spoke with Anders Winroth on last week, has become its own thing. Aside from that, it's not just white supremacists that have adopted things from the Viking Age or Viking culture. We see it on brands all across the world as almost a symbol of reliability. You have Viking cruisers, you have fucking Viking tools, delivery companies, everything.
Yeah. It's, it can kind of mean whatever you would like it to mean. And really when you dig into the Viking Age, isn't that sort of what was happening? Like, wherever they went, something different would happen. If they sort of assimilated into French culture in Normandy, or they took over half of England, or gave up on the Vinland experiment. So you sort of have this sort of adaptive type of people. So it's really not surprising that the image itself is that adaptive now. But yeah, like, in the 19th century, for instance, some people associated the power of the British Navy and British Empire with their roots in the Viking Age, right? The Scandinavian blood had this prowess on the sea, so now the British do too. So, but on the other hand, people would point to the early, like Althingi in Iceland, say, oh, the Vikings were harbingers of democracy, so that's where America gets their ideas from. So it is really whatever they want it to mean. And I just think looking at that picture and that spectrum is so fascinating, and because it can mean so many things to so many people.
It is so fascinating, because I don't know, or I can't think of another time period, particularly quite a short period of time, that so many people attach themselves to, or so many people look back to, or so many companies, brands, and kind of want to associate with in some way, or use it to promote their products. You don't get it for, I don't know, I guess you do get it for even for the Romans. I don't feel like it's not used as much, or the Egyptians, or the Greek, or the Spartans. None of these kind of warrior groups hold the same power, I guess, in today's culture.
There is one group, but it's specifically tied to the U.S., and this is sort of what I talked about in my research, and that's the frontiersmen, and
Okay.
sort of this pioneer, man that lives sort of between uh, civilization and the wilderness,
Mm,
self-reliant sort of thing, and in many ways, um, I think the Vikings sort of took on that personality over time. And so, but in the States especially, there's a lot of the pioneers and the early
yeah.
settlers are really really romanticized, and probably not in the same way, but I think that there has been some like meshing there.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So you said we start back in 1830, I believe.
Right. I mean, this is specifically target. I had to narrow it down, so I'm talking specifically about the U.S. And In 1837, there was a publication by a Danish philologist, Carl Christensen, and it was titled Antiquitates Americanae, and it was published in Latin, Danish, and some parts in English. And this was, for the first time, a scholarly work on the Vinland sagas, and people in the U.S. were, you know, outside of a handful of specialists, were privy to the fact that there were these medieval texts written about the Norse coming to North America. And so this, of course, caused quite a stir and created a lot of interesting texts, a lot of really bad texts, some interesting discourse. By the end of the century, into the 19th century, there's this sort of Leif Erikson versus Christopher Columbus, who really discovered America thing going back and forth. And yeah, so you can kind of, in the UK, in England especially, there had already been a resurgence of interest in uh, Old Norse and the Vikings and the literature. And this sort of bleeds into the US, but especially kickstarts with this text, and when this becomes sort of recited in other English texts throughout the early part or the middle part of the century.
Mm-hmm. I feel like us and the USA have been tied together when it comes to popular culture for a long time. Originally, it probably went from the UK to the USA, but I think in recent years, it's very much gone the other way. I often see trends that happen, even sometimes negative things. When I know I've seen when sometimes when riots happen in the USA concerning predominantly issues that are isolated to America, a lot of the time with things like police brutality. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't happen in the UK, but it's certainly not an issue like in the USA. I remember there was one of the riots that happened, and I remember saying to one of my friends, I was like, "Oh, people are gonna see that online, and that's gonna happen here." And within like 3 or 4 days, there were a bunch of riots over here. So I think for whatever reason, the two countries have been tied culturally for a long time. So it doesn't surprise me that once it starts to get resurgence over here, it kind of goes back.
Right. And there were, especially at the time, if you think about 1830s, the US were still kind of searching around for their big name authors. James Fenimore Cooper's coming. He's sort of the big one. We've got Longfellow is the big poet, but for the most part, a lot of the literature is coming from the UK over to the US. And I think Cooper was maybe the only respected author in the UK from the everybody in the UK hated the US writers at that time. But yeah, eventually, for better or worse, I think my country became some interest. It made some interesting trends throughout the
Yeah, we were just sulking that you kicked us out. That's all.
Well, that's a little bit before my time for research. So
Okay, so we start to see. Oh, you said the Vinland sagas. What happens then? I guess when it comes to people really getting this interesting, because I always thought the Leif Erikson kind of debate was a more modern one. I didn't realize it went back so far. I just assumed that Christopher Columbus won out, and everyone always assumed it was him until more recent times.
well, it was sort of a small group of people, but because a lot of the Scandinavian settlers in the US around that time, the middle of the century, were predominantly Lutheran and Protestant, Leif Erikson sort of became this Protestant, rallying cry of saying like, "Oh, look, we really discovered America. It wasn't a Catholic." This sort of it sort of devolved into this anti-Catholic discourse. Rasmus B. Anderson published a book near the end of the century called "America Not Discovered by Columbus." There's some interesting things in there, and Shipley Brown, Marie Shipley Brown, she also wrote a book that it was very much a Vatican cover-up. So the theory is, and this can be debated in many different spheres, but the theory is that Christopher Columbus actually sailed to Iceland in the 1470s. And whatever he did there, we don't really know. If he came here, we don't really know. Some people say yes, some people say no. But what these American people from the 19th century, what they jump to is, oh, he must have come into contact with the Vinland sagas and therefore learned about America from the Icelanders. So either way you look at it, the Icelandic people, the Norse, are the real discoverers of America, because either it was Leif Erikson who made it there, or it was Columbus learning it from the Icelanders, and so this is some small pockets, but I think one of the most really interesting things actually is how this discovery narrative is actually situated in American history at that time. Basically, what Carl Christian Raffin does, with the help of some others, is he points to specific artifacts found in New England to say, this is where Vinland was, in the New England area near Boston. If he had sort of maybe not done that, it would have been a great piece of scholarship, but he was really hell-bent on saying, I know exactly where Vinland is. And one of the things he pointed to was the Dighton Rock, which was this big stone found in Massachusetts, which had some strange carvings on it. And he said this was definitely Norse. He thought he could figure out some rune symbols that said Thorfinn Karlsefni, who was one of the people that came to Vinland according to the sagas. The problem is that rock had been attributed to the Phoenicians, the Chinese, the Welsh, every imaginable civilization up to that point. Different people had theorized about what that was. And so sort of what this Danish philologist is doing is sort of taking the Vinland story and placing it in this American context that had already existed, which is, we think someone was here before the indigenous people, but we don't know who it is. And so anything that we find, we're going to attribute it to that ancient civilization. And this is sort of what he's doing with these artifacts. And there was a skeleton that had been found with some armor on it, and the Newport Tower, which they had said was definitely a Norse structure, but was actually built in the 1600s.
Is that the one that got associated with the Templars as well?
Yes.
Yeah,
There's like some novels about the Templars and the.
yeah. I think that featured on the American Runestone TV show. I
Okay.
I think they went there as they were running out of things to talk about the Kensington Runestone.
Uh,
Um, no, go on.
I love the Kensington Runestone story. I don't know if you've read Myths of the Runestone,
I
but
haven't read that. No.
okay. I think it's David Kruger, and just goes into this story, and the poor guy that just devoted his whole life to proving it was true, and never really getting that satisfaction.
Yeah.
It's a heartbreaking story, but it's really fascinating.
Oh, for sure. Um, okay, so I guess we have a an increased interest in Vikings or in the Icelandic sagas. How do we get from there, from the whole Leif Erikson Christopher Columbus argument, to where we are today, of a lot of it being co-opted by these white supremacist groups?
I mean, it's a bit complicated because if you look at the fiction or the poetry produced, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the Vikings look very, very different than they do today. And this is in part because the Vikings, and you could argue this about any type of historical fiction or historical film or whatever. It's going to reflect the contemporary values or culture, whatever is making it. So in the Victorian era, the Vikings appear very chivalric, and they're often Christian, and they have these values like self-control, which was very important during the Victorian age. But as the culture and society sort of changes, so do the Vikings, and they become increasingly violent. And you can kind of point to the 1958 film, The Vikings, as well as the novel that inspired it, which was The Viking by Edison Marshall. This is you can sort of see here where the Vikings are there. You've passed the point of no return. They're no longer chivalric. In fact, they're incredibly violent, even against women, and this sort of rape and pillage, generic look of the Vikings starts to take shape. And you can point to a lot of things, and basically what I boiled it down to is I looked at some of these cultural ideas that were changing at that time. One of them being changing from Victorian manliness to sort of 20th century masculinity, and this being the most important thing for a man. Whereas in the Victorian era, being a man meant taking care of his family and having self-control and taking care of his body and this sort of thing. But with changes to the economy, business taking off, these types of things, and it became a little more cutthroat, a little more competitive. And so now competition, which was before a vice, is now seen as a manly virtue. And over time, this takes shape in popular culture in places like the Vikings, who are known to be ruthless killers in the past. And so it's sort of embellished, and all along this time you can see sort of the Vikings are Nordic, so they're white. There's a lot of it's hard to really put your finger on it, but when you talk about what I talked about with the anti-Catholic stuff, it's us, not them. Or the discovery narrative where it's saying, oh, this runestone is actually, this means this land is for us, not them. And so there's always this sort of divide, this sort of us versus somebody else. And this takes form in the racial discourse over time. And you can see it in how the Vikings confront the Native Americans in these Vinland stories, right? If anybody has had the displeasure of seeing, there's a movie from the 1970s called The Norseman, starring Lee Majors, that is basically a Wild West movie, but with Vikings. Don't ever watch it; it's so bad. But you can sort of see how this, this is not culturally important, so it probably didn't impact anything. But you can see how this sort of worked, where the Vikings are sort of cowboys, and there's this sort of superiority over a different culture, and this takes shape in different ways where the men are dominant over women over time, and so there's always a sort of an other that's being dominated by this group of people.
Mm-hmm. So is there like a single point where we see it going from it starts to just be adopted by white supremacists? Because I guess what was the political landscape racially? Did you say the 1950s?
Yeah, there's not really a point. And so, what I try to do is sort of trace these ideas through time and how these ideas sort of pick up. So, one of my main arguments is that the adventure story is based on the frontier story. And when you have a story about the American frontier, you have ideas like manifest destiny, like white superiority, like dominant manliness or masculinity, depending on what time period you're using. And so when you use like Natty Bumppo from the Leatherstocking Tales was like the archetype of an adventure hero. And so what a lot of people are doing is just sort of swapping him out and putting a different character in. But because they're using that template, some of these ideas of that frontier narrative continues through time. And so you can see a lot of times a Viking adventure story carrying these ideas of being a frontier hero, of carrying this like white superiority. So for me, you can see these sort of things continue through literary history and into film history. But if you want to look at specific points in time, there are a couple, one of which, of course, you could point to World War II, when the Nazis were interested in, some Nazis were interested in Old Norse mythology, and of course the SS symbol, the S runes, and there's a lot of dabbling in that sort of thing. So that's sort of inspired some people. And then the other really interesting one is the very, very early Norse pagan movement in the U.S. Focused specifically on Aryan Brotherhood, members of the Aryan Brotherhood in prison. And Arthur Rudd Mills was really influential in this. He was an Australian white supremacist. And then the woman's name that operated in America, she was building an Aryan army and recruiting specifically white supremacists to join her Old Norse religion. And the people that are actually in the heathen community now know about the controversial figure of Stephen McNellan, who has dabbled in metagenetics or whatever he calls it. I forget the actual term for. So there is this sort of these are the two specific point in times for me that this has been really like, this is what's happening. But I think it's been more subtle in popular culture where you don't really see it. And so there's this sort of association. You see a bunch of white men on screen. In the 1958 film, this is something really subtle. But in the book that it's based on, there was a character named Sandpiper, who was a Moor. He was a black man from Spain. And he's sort of just around the Vikings. and Elsie Christensen. Thanks, Bob. Yeah, that was her name. Um, Sandpiper is just sort of there, but he's sort of free to come and go as he wants. But in the film, they couldn't really figure out what to do with him, so they put an iron ring around his neck. So he's a slave. So there's this. This happened in the '70s film with the Norsemen. Deacon Jones, the American football player, was a Viking in the crew. He doesn't have any lines in the movie. He's just there with his huge muscles rowing the boat. And in the credits, he's named Thrall, which is Old Norse for slave. And so there's this idea that people of color could only exist in this period by being a slave or by being an enemy or something. And so when you see this repeated over and over of these white, violent, dominant people, you start to get a sense of there's no real, like, it's just so supposed to be entertainment, but when it's repeated in this way over and over again, it sends a certain message the image is shaped in a certain way to say this is a white, dominant, violent male. That dominates other people, other cultures, other ethnicities.
So is that just another case, as we were talking about earlier, of the Vikings changing with the times? So the landscape at the moment is, you're coming out from a period of slavery in the USA. So that's why you're then seeing the Black and people of color characters in there portrayed as slaves rather than being able to be anything else.
I don't think it's that direct. I don't think it's point A to point B. I think when they look back at the Viking Age, there's this idea of what it is. And, the 1978 film basically looked to the 1958 film for historical inspiration, which of course that one was baloney as well. So you just have this like.
But is that not just looking back on what those people know and the history that they know directly? Because obviously anybody who knows about the actual time period would know that, yes, the Vikings did take slaves, but they were Celtic, Anglo-Saxon. They were the places they were invading. They weren't going all the way down to Northern Africa to take slaves, because it made no, as sad as it sounds, economic sense to do so. So do you think that the people making, I guess, the people making these films were looking back and genuinely thinking the Vikings took Black slaves, or is it a case of that they were looking back at their own history and going, well, this is what we know, so this must therefore be true for other times?
I think a little bit of both. If anyone's seen the film Pathfinder, the very, very beginning of the film is an indigenous woman finds a wrecked Viking ship, which it's way too big to be a Viking ship. And in the hull of this Viking ship are bodies in chains. And of course, one of them is Black. And this brings to mind the slave trade that happened in the U.S. And part of this is to present the Vikings as evil colonizers. That was their goal in that film, was to colonize. They use terms like wipe out this group, so there's this is like reflecting back. And then there's also this idea, like the 1928 film, The Viking, when they showed Leif Erikson land in Vinland, it's very, very much, he kneels, he has a cross made out of oars, he lifts his hands up. And this is sort of just saying, well, we don't know what the Leif Erikson discovery would have looked like, so let's just use the Christopher Columbus, what we think about that one. And so there's this idea that, like, whatever was past, and that just works. And so in some sense, it's like, oh yeah, there were Black slaves in the past. Let's just throw that in there as a way to show this is set sometime in the past, without really like getting down to the nitty gritty of what's going on there.
in the chat, Jennifer just made a what I think is a fantastic point of that maybe they would use a black person for the slave because the audience would just automatically associate, particularly at that time period, black person and slave. So they wouldn't. You said that they didn't have a role in the movie. They didn't have any spoken lines, so it wouldn't need explaining. The audience would just automatically go, "Oh, okay, there's a black person there, particularly with a ring around the neck, slave," and it's just easier dialogue than having a white person there and having to have maybe some sort of dialogue to explain that they were captive. And as awful as that sounds, maybe that could just be the case of that it was easy because that's what people knew and the audience knew at that time.
Absolutely. That's absolutely the case, especially in the 58 film, because Tony Curtis, who plays one of the main characters, he's also a slave. So the role of Sandpiper is to just be a visual aid for Tony Curtis's plight. But that's a terrible way to use black bodies on screen.
Oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
And again, it perpetuates, this just domination theme of this of the Vikings being able to kind of do what they want and take who they want. And especially like the Pathfinder one is the most bewildering, because if you think about it, they probably, they're in Vinland, so they took these slaves across the ocean. Where did they pick these people up, and why did they take them here exactly? It's a really, really unfortunate thing, and there's been a lot of research from a lot of scholars about the role of black bodies in films that could talk about this way better than I could. But it's definitely like a visual, aid for what's going on in the film. And in the 1928 film, the main character gets sold also into slavery. And again, at the slavers market, there is a black body there, again, to sort of just emphasize that this is actually what's happening,
Mm-hmm. And I guess then you can see the path as to how those who then look back at the Vikings in a favorable light can then make that association with power over anybody who isn't white, I guess.
Yeah, and I doubt anybody will watch a 1928 movie and say, yeah, that's for me. But again, I think it's this repetition
it's small increments of just a little bit by bit. It gets embedded in people's minds, because sitting here today in 2023, you were describing how the Vikings were portrayed, the dominance, very hyper masculine dominance over women, very violent, and you today we're looking at that thinking, well, why would people want to associate themselves with that? Why would people hold that up to such a high regard and be like, that's the ideal, that's what we want to be like? That for most people, particularly when it comes to those interested in the Vikings, we want to try and step away from that image and get back to this idea of farmers, innovators, and we want to go down that route. And yes, there was a violent side, but there was all these other things as well. But yeah, so this image that some people are aspiring to, and it's sitting here today, it's odd and it's strange to think why people would, but I guess back in 1950, 1960, 1970, there are a group of men. So on the back of that, why do you think there is a group of people who are looking at this and what are quite unlikable qualities, but going, oh, well, that's what I want to associate myself with. That's what I want to be like. That's me.
I mean, on one hand, what you're talking about, they were innovators. They were, crossing the Atlantic Ocean in that type of ship. That took some guts. That took a lot of courage. And so there are admirable qualities for sure. and I don't think that it's necessarily bad to depict the violence, but it's interesting to see that that's what's focused on. Of course, that's probably what sells movies too, right? And so you can't have it both ways, but like one of the things that I sort of miss is like, okay, if you really want to, make something a little bit more accurate or authentic or whatever word you want to use, if you want to look at like Eos Saga, this guy is really violent, but he also follows it up with this really eloquent poetry, right? It's like, why are we missing the poetry? And so it's just interesting to see what's left out. Now, I think, we mentioned this when we were texting earlier. I think that one of the more recent films, The Northman, that came out a couple years ago, I think that they are really trying to portray the Vikings as villains, as people that you should not admire. And this is a really interesting tragedy told on screen, and yet you still see like frothing at the mouth, white, extremely violent masculine man, right? And so it's really interesting how that film tries to buck these trends, and I think it succeeds in some ways and fails in other ways. But I think that's the first time that you sort of see them being like, oh, we should not like these people. They are the villains.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay, but to go back to the people who, particularly in white supremacists, who co-opted a lot of this. What do you think the reason was? Because it seems like, did it mainly kind of kick off in the 50s, 60s, that sort of time where the two became entwined? Am I right in thinking, or would it have been before that?
I mean, you do have. I mean, there is some earlier stuff, but you could talk about the esoteric Nazism, where this Old Norse mythology sort of thrown into this Germanic Volkish kind of movement. So that's older, and some people look to that, right, as inspiration. And then the heathen pagan movement in the U.S. That's another. But I think what it really comes down to for me is like, okay, a lot of people have Scandinavian heritage or Northern Germanic, because if you look at something like Tacitus, there's this romanticized look at Northern Germanic people. They have similar religions, right? And these religions are lost after the introduction to Christianity, except for we still get the Old Norse. And the Scandinavians, especially when you look at like something like Sweden, these are sort of the last holdouts of Europe as far as like this old pre-Christian religion. And so there's this sort of underdog. We lost our identity, we lost our culture. And I think that having a place to belong, having something to believe in, and because the Eddas are so rich and so colorful, and there's so much that survives that you can look at. I think that appeals to the people as well.
But I feel like that appeals to a lot of Americans. I have a business selling Viking themed products, whatever you want to call it, and we sell tons to the USA. So there are a bunch of people who are interested in this, and probably because, like you say, a lot of people have particularly European heritage. The USA as a country isn't that old, so it makes sense to look back this direction. And the Vikings is a very cool time. It is a very cool point in history for people to look at and find joy in learning about. So, but not everybody then takes that to, oh, well, a white superiority So where does that happen? Because there are even today there are tons of people who are interested in Vikings and are
Right.
very, very progressive, very diverse, very welcoming.
Most people, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. But there is certainly a group who aren't. And so, what point does this kind of happen, or do we know like a reason for it, or an idea of like what's going on? Maybe what's going on. Like, say you said that there isn't a single point where we can go, okay, this is where it started to happen. So I was wondering whether culture, whether there's something missing in society where this starts to happen, where people are angry and want to be seen as this hyper masculine figure, or what. I'm just trying to figure out why it can happen, and maybe there isn't an answer.
I don't think there's a really good answer. Again, you could kind of look at Gardell's smorgasbord and being like, okay, I like this, I like this. This Old Norse symbol was associated with esoteric Nazism, so I like this as well. I don't think that there's anything specific that you can point to. I think it's an accumulation over time, but I do think that this sort of like this European heritage is important, but also the European heritage that fought Christianity, because Christian culture became the norm. And so there is this sort of pull, I think, for certain people to say like, yeah, we are these warriors. You think about another hate group, the Ku Klux Klan. They saw themselves as medieval knights, and so it's not too far to think that other people were reaching to the medieval period for these sort of like white archetypes, this white heritage. So I don't really know exactly why the Vikings became this, other than they're so flexible and there's so many, they were predominantly, Northern Germanic and therefore white. They did move around a lot. This is, exciting. And they were violent. They were dominant in some ways. And so it's just sort of cherry picking what they want out of different cultural groups to have something, say that this represents them. But I don't think you can point to like one specific thing or one specific idea. Say, yeah, I'm going to take this. I would recommend, if you want to know more, Matthias Gardell's book. Stephanie von Schnurbein wrote another book about this, and Norse paganism kind of stuff. And yeah, and it's not just the Vikings, but this medieval period in general, as we saw in the aftermath of Charlottesville. Like, there were only a handful of Old Norse symbols and Old Norse runes, but there were a lot of medieval symbols and even some like ancient Rome symbols, and so like medievalists in general were alarmed, and not just Old Norse. But there has been this, I think there's been this flirtation for a long time, this relationship that just really hasn't been talked about until after that time, to say like, hey, nobody like put a finger up to say, wait a second, maybe we shouldn't be doing this like anti-Catholic stuff with Leif Erikson, or this taking indigenous culture or land and saying, oh yeah, this is an artifact that's really attributed to this group. And so again, it's these accumulations over time that I think give it this pull.
Mm-hmm. I've got two ways I want to take this now. Okay, first, I mean, I assume a lot the Nazis have and Hitler have a lot to answer for, because obviously he had a fascination with like the Aryan race, and that certainly points towards Scandinavia. He adopted a lot like the runic symbols, a lot of Nordic based symbology. So I guess then when you have anybody who holds similar ideas today, I don't walk in these circles. But I would assume that, one for a better phrase, that like the Nazis are the holy grail to white supremacists. I guess I would assume that they would look back at those as like the heights. So therefore, when they're adopting a lot of these symbols, they're gonna do the same.
I mean, the one thing about the Vikings and Old Norse, mythology is that everybody wanted credit for it, and so you see, early, like late 19th century Germans trying to say like, oh well, the Edda really came from us, because we had this like similar culture, and like we have the same mythology, and they looked at Tacitus, who really romanticized the Scandinavians, and it's something so appealing about this that everybody wants a slice. A really great example was in the lead up to the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. Chicago had a huge Swedish population at that time, and there's a guy, I'm going to forget his name, I'm so sorry, but he wrote his own version of the Vinland sagas and was very careful to use like broad terms like Northmen, and it was to include the Swedes in the discovery of America, because they wanted a part of it, they wanted to be present. And so like the Norwegians, the Icelanders, the Swedes, all wanted to be included in this event. And I think, I think the Germans and you can actually look at many different cultures. One of the I taught a class recently where they had to choose a country to talk about, like the Viking reception and the heritage that developed, and even some countries in South and Central America have some association. There's this theory that I'm going to mispronounce this name because I always get it wrong. The Aztec god Quetzalcoatl was actually a Viking that had showed up. So he was thought to be a god. He had a red beard in all these depictions in Central America. And so there's like all these different cultures trying to grab a piece of this really unique and, as you said, brief moment in history. And I don't think the Nazis were all that different. But interesting, Hitler really didn't. From what I understand, I think Heather O'Donoghue talks about this, but I think he wasn't really that interested in Old Norse mythology. He didn't really he needed the churches, so he didn't want to dabble in that realm.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's just, I guess I'm bad for trying to figure out like why things, and trying to understand. And I guess with a lot of this stuff, there is very little understanding because it comes from a place of idiocracy and ignorance, and a bunch of other mean words that I can say if I want to, but so I guess trying to put a logical answer and place to something that is sometimes illogical, because I guess like a lot of these symbols, if you look at them historically, they don't have these meanings. For a lot of them, we don't know what they mean. So then to see them used in places by people that certainly don't know what they originally mean, but them taking on a new meaning in current culture is frustrating. And I guess just trying to figure out like why choose these symbols that clearly don't have this original meaning. What point have you kind of gone, oh, this is a symbol for me? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you could make the same argument for the swastika, because it was originally an Indian symbol, right? Had nothing to do with German culture. It was adopted from, I think, India, and it meant something about peace. but that doesn't mean it anymore, and that's unfortunate. And I'm sure the people that really held that to be a symbol. In fact, there was a fish company here in Iceland that was the symbol for their company, for the logo, and it was on a building until very, very recently, when they were like, all right, maybe we should get this off of here. And so yeah, it's really scary to think about something like as innocuous as Thor's hammer, the Mjolnir, being, going down that road, and as we talked about earlier, there are these moments of hesitation. There are these sticky situations with that symbol. And so I don't think it's beyond, recovering, but it at some point, I think like it's out of your hands, again, this is sort of a different topic, but it's sort of like how every few years somebody wants to come up with a more academic word for Vikings because it's got all these associations to it. And so, you'll see a book about the late Iron Age Northern Germanic warriors. It's like it's just not going to work. And so, and I know I've heard from other, scholars who really like, I don't want the word Viking on my book, but
yeah, we spoke about that.
Yeah, with Anders, right?
Yeah, he said about, uh, just the way that the word means, the what people look and think of it, but also people know the word and people know what they're gonna get.
Yeah,
It's,
and
it's a tough.
and it's a bit frustrating, and at the same time, if that's what it is, that's you kind of have to like, okay, where do we go from here? And I think that's a really interesting. I've been to several conferences where this is the question, like, okay, this association between Old Norse culture, Vikings, whatever, and these extremist groups that exist. What do we do about it? And I think that's a really interesting thing. And it's there's not a really perfect answer, other than having conversations like this, being able to talk more openly, and something that people didn't do for ages, to say like, oh yeah, these associations exist, and to maybe talk more frequently, people giving talks at conferences, publishing things. But then there's this sort of divide about like, okay, let's say you publish an article, is it $150 behind a paywall? Then the people who are, associating with these things, they're not gonna, are they gonna read that? And what's the best way to get out there? And there's some people like Jackson Crawford, who I think is doing a really interesting thing, reaching a new and different group by these YouTube videos. And he's sort of a man of the people, and not your typical scholar. And I think things like that are really helpful to sort of, I don't want to say set the record straight, but to at least engage in conversation to get people thinking.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because there is a point where these symbols probably can't come back, like the swastika. They're every so often you get a group of, I'm sure, well-intended people who try to take back the swastika and give it back its original meaning. But a symbol like that is too far gone. It means it's caused too much hurt to too many people. And whilst hopefully none of the Milner or the Valkyrie never get associated with anything as severe as, hopefully nothing like that ever happens again as the Holocaust. But the more we see them in films like Becky, at the Capitol riots, at the storm of the Capitol, at the Charlottesville riots, as we see them more and more like that, and everyday people, because it's not the people who are interested in this that we need to worry about, because most people who are interested in this field have a deeper understanding that what these symbols actually mean. it's the general public that is not the issue, but it's the general public who are seeing these symbols and don't know any better. So just automatic, because they don't have the time to do the research either, or the want, or the interest. So they just see these symbols associated with these people, and it just sticks in their mind. So the next time they see this symbol, it's just a symbol for white supremacy, because they don't need to do any further research. They just see it on those people. And that was the whole reason why we created this podcast. Was that I started using people of color as models in my business, and got a bunch of hate and kind of pushback from the certain group of people who are into this stuff and are cunts. Let's call them cunts. They are cunts. So we got a bunch of kind of hate. So me and Mateus had a conversation. We started the podcast in an idea that we could inform people who get themselves, who do like this whole area, who wear a Milner, and if somebody does come and say that's a symbol of hate, or they can then articulate themselves to say, no, this is what it is. So, and it kind of just passes on that education, rather than being put in a position where you go, oh, no, it isn't, but then can't back yourself up. And I think that's how we fight back's the right word, I don't know, but that's how we kind of work back and take these not take these symbols back, but kind of stop them getting degraded even further, is to educate the people who wear them, so they can then educate those who are outside. Because the people on the fringe who don't have an interest in this haven't got the interest or the want or the time to research symbols. Who does? And I'm probably guilty of it. You know, if I saw a white supremacist wearing a symbol from, I don't know, just a different group of people that I'm not interested in, from, let's just say, Japanese culture, for what, just for the purpose of the argument. If I just saw them wearing a symbol from like a Japanese culture, but I don't know the symbol, I don't know anything about it, I've never really seen it before, but I've only seen it on the white supremacist, I just automatically go, oh, that's probably just some racist symbol, and I go along with my day. And then the next time I see it, it's just like, oh, that's that fucking racist symbol again, because you don't know any better. And that's what's frustrating, I think. And that's my way that I think we can try and counteract this.
Absolutely. And, I hope to at some point get something turned into a book from my research, because I do think that that time frame, that even though it's big and it stretches, but it's when you can look and say like, oh, these are some of the reasons why things progressed in a certain way, can really help us to say like, okay, maybe we can take a step back and look at this, in a different way, or challenge, how we see things. And hopefully the next wave, of novelists and film directors and different creatives can use that to create a better depiction. And again, to use the Northmen, like I do have some issues with the story itself, but I think that you can tell by watching it, they are trying really hard to sidestep some of these issues that we're talking about, and in subtle ways, just to avoid these pitfalls, and that's encouraging. And even if it's a, I think it's a great movie, but even if it's a bit flawed, maybe the next version that we see will be even better, and it's sort of just learning from the past and trying to depict things in a better way. Because one of the downsides is when you're in the trenches like this, looking at this kind of stuff, it's hard to actually enjoy these things. And so when the Northman comes out, it's the first major production about Vikings in maybe 5-6 years, and everybody's looking for this now. they're like, oh, are they gonna buy into this? Is there gonna be something there for these types of people? And that's a lot of pressure. And I think they overall did a pretty good job. But that's something that's really like it's become part of the discourse now. You have to take this into account as to what you are presenting. And that's an encouraging thought going forward that people are going to keep that in mind. They're going to want to be careful not to pander or not to present something in a way that's going to be taken out of context.
Mm-hmm. Which is often what those people want to do, is take things out of context. Because a lot of the time, I think their whole ideology is built on a house of cards, because they're probably brought up in some echo chamber where they've been fed certain things by their parents, or maybe they've just never interacted with other races, other ethnicities, so they've just become isolated, and their parents have taught them like the other mentality, and it's just how they've been brought up. So hopefully through conversations like this, they, even if somebody listens to an episode like this, or somebody that's listened to this then has a conversation with somebody, you can kind of start to, usually if you can take away one card, the whole thing falls. If you can say, oh well, this idea of these symbols coming, being some symbol of white supremacy, actually this is where they come from. They come from this kind of step by step approach of progression from the 1800s through to today. There's no real basis on any idea of like white people being superior. So, and then hopefully that kind of puts a chink in the armor, and then they maybe start looking at other things that they believe, and over a period of time that wall comes down and they can see things a little more clearly, because that's usually is what it takes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also important to note that the idea of white supremacy does not, or superiority also does not mean these extremist groups. It could just be, like I talked about, like this reoccurring theme of dominance, that these people were stronger and taller and better in battle, and so on and so forth, that it creates this sort of mirage of superiority, whether and that might not lead directly to an extremist groups, but it's going to affect, when it's repeated like this, it's going to, in my mind, affect how someone views a certain character or a group of people. And so, like, yeah, I don't think everybody that's, of course, not everybody that's taking these ideas are joining extremist groups, but I think that the important thing about these conversations is to sort of break that subtlety. We're not going to stop extremists from being extreme. In my early days of my PhD, my supervisor had to keep telling me, "Hey, man, you're not going to end white supremacy. So stop preaching." But to like those people are going to decide what, no matter what I say. But the people that have these vague ideas in their head about what the past may have been like, or what this group of people may have been like, I think those are the people that you have to try to say, like, try to reach and try to help gather information and to have these conversations with, because it's not always just like, this extreme racist idea. It's just this sort of like, yeah, okay, I think, you talk about the Kensington runestone. The Kensington runestone sort of helped these white Scandinavian settlers sort of feel more like they were a part of that land that they had taken from indigenous people, right? And so it worked in a certain way against somebody else, and that's the thing that I want to try to highlight and say, this is what we want to break away from, because like you said, the Vikings were not only that, they were innovators, sailors, farmers, and so on.
Yeah. I think as well there's often so many other factors going into why people in any it, no matter what people believe, there's usually a lot of different factors going into why people believe what they believe, and this is probably just one part of that. Because I think it was Demarian who just made a comment, and to paraphrase it, it was that people are gonna watch what they watch and take from it what they want to take from it, and we've all met people where maybe, or even our friends will watch the same piece of media and then reflect on it, and we've both got completely different things from it, or it just happens how life has led us our certain directions, and we just look at things with our own lenses and our own viewpoint. So we just take things how we want to take it sometimes, and that's unfortunately probably what we can't stop people doing. Is no matter what piece of media we put out there, they're going to look for the bits that support their ideology.
Yeah. But what we can do is try to make it so that these subtleties start to disappear a little bit, and these nuances are a little more clear. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's ways to just tweak that when you make something creative.
Yeah. Okay, before we wrap up, we haven't really touched on masculinity too much. Now, I would class myself as probably a very masculine man. I grew up playing rugby. I've been to the gym all my life. I've got an interest in martial arts. I've trained martial arts. I got a beard. Got an interest in the Viking Age, in Vikings. I would say on paper, and certainly to look at covered in tattoos, I would say on paper and just like that initial, at a glance, people would consider me like a masculine male. Now, obviously,
Not me. I'm the what you refer to as a wimp.
But yeah, so I would, like I say, I would consider myself to be a masculine male. Now, I clearly haven't gone down the route of this idea of white supremacy. Where do you think that link is between? Because there also is a clear link. Because I would say a lot of the people who do support this ideology, particularly the ones that I've seen at the rights, or you see on TV shows, or you see like in prison in the Aryan Brotherhood, they are that very archetypal masculine male. They all want to be tough. They all want to show how how hard they are, and it is that they do kind of go together.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about the Viking Age, you do have some sources that, for instance, if you look at the Vinland sagas, the author says that the indigenous people they came in contact with were small, and there's this idea that the Norse were taller. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but you can be sure that rowing a boat across the ocean is going to build some muscle. And so, yeah, they're probably fit, probably in good health. And so there's this. I mean, there is this romanticizing, but there also probably, just like the violence, there probably is some truth to it. But I think what it comes down to is this idea of domination again. What's the greatest form of domination over woman? And it's rape. And what do Vikings stereotypically do? They rape. And so there is this sense of like the Vikings being the most masculine people because they are killing and they're raping and they are showing this dominance over people. But again, this reflects just the contemporary culture in which we're in currently, because in the past, like I said, the Vikings were chivalric, and they in Ottilie Liljenkrantz's novel, the Thrall of Leif the Lucky from 1902, the Vikings are are incredibly capable of self-control. They protect women. There's not even a hint of rape in that book particularly, and this changes over time because the definition of what makes a man over time changed.
Mm-hmm.
And there is absolutely nothing wrong with any of those things that you described yourself as, or that you look like or do. The problem is when you start setting standards as to like, this is what makes a man a man. It's this,
I guess what I was trying to get is that the two do tend to go hand in hand. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with being a masculine man, and there's nothing wrong with anything. Be who the fuck you want to be, but there's nothing wrong with. I don't think there's anything wrong with being masculine, but there is certainly, or it seems to be a link between like hyper masculinity and white supremacy. They just, in my eyes anyway, they just seem to go together. This idea, if you take away like the whole racist side of it, you still will be left with a group of men who just want to be tough, want to be the best at everything, want to have dominance. They do just kind of go together.
Yeah, I mean, you read any book from third wave feminists from the early 1990s. This goes back to Black feminist scholars to the 1970s. Is that gender and race they often go hand in hand, and some people throw class in there. That to study one, you can't study the other, and so it makes total sense that this domination over others would be women and people of color. And a lot of this can be traced back to the early part of the 20th century, and some of the race science stuff that came out that equated people of color, especially Black men, with women. And this had to do with like skull shapes and sizes and stuff. And so there's always been this sort of mixing of gender and race. And I would recommend Manliness and Civilization. Her name's gonna slip my mind for the moment. But it was a book that came out in like 93 that talks about this, how these things continue to be intertwined for so long. And so, it's almost impossible to point out one without talking to the other.
Mm-hmm. Do you think is there any way to decide like a reason for that, or is it just the type of? Because the other thing, I don't know. It does always seem to be men. It can't just be men that are racist. That's a fucking ridiculous thing to think, but it does often seem to be men. Obviously, it's not just men, but it does seem to be men a lot, maybe on the surface or outwardly spoken.
There's a great book that came out a few years ago by Sayward Darby, excuse me, called Sisters in Hate. And she interviews 3 or 4 women in hate groups, and there is this sort of gymnastics that they have to do that Sayward sort of highlights, that these hate groups, and you also see this in some of the like racist pagan groups too, where there's men and then there's women, and the women in leadership have to really like do this sort of mental gymnastics as to like their place in all of this, because they are subordinate. And again, like, to say where this comes from, you have to trawl back through centuries of scientific discourse and all different kind of stuff. But I think a lot of where it comes from is from that late 19th, early 20th century race science that equates at least in this sense, Black men with with women. Again, like there's been a lot of research on this from the early 1990s about how these things are intertwined. And I should have glanced at my dissertation to give a few names at this point, but and it also seems that a lot of, an easy cop out is to say that everybody from that time period was racist, especially in the US, that there was some sort of racist thing going on. But it also seemed that certain people that were interested in masculinity were also outspoken against race as well. Thomas Carlyle, who gave these, talked about Odin in one of his 1930s talks, or maybe it was a bit later. And, he was pretty outspoken, but he was also like, Odin was this great man and highlighted the manliness of him. Mm-hmm. And then you have someone like Charles Kingsley, who was also incredibly racist, who's also talking about manliness and his Christian muscular Christianity that he was sort of the face of. And so, yeah, these things have gone hand in hand for centuries. And I'm certainly not an expert to sort of explain how we got here.
No, I mean, you can see if you do have a group of people who are fascinated with masculinity and dominance and power, why they would look at the Vikings, because it is so synonymous with it today. It's the same reason why you see it in like bodybuilding circles, in general weightlifting circles, in military circles. They all look towards Vikings, obviously not for the same reasons as hate groups, but it is that kind of masculine, very hyper masculine symbol of strength and power. So you can see why all these different groups look back at it and then also take different aspects for it to fit the different groups and what they want to do and perceive, I guess.
And yeah, and like I said at the beginning, like that's sort of the nature of the Vikings, because when you really think about it, like the handful of sources that we have that are contemporary to the Viking Age are, monks that are terrified for their lives, or like think that the end of the world is happening because they're being raided by these people over and over again. So you only have a certain side of it. And then all the Old Norse texts don't come till much, much, much later, long after the Viking Age is gone. So you already have, and even then, like you think about the Edda, Snorri's Edda, even, that it was probably written, in the 13th century, but it doesn't exist until 14th century. Mm-hmm. And so, and then what survives, and then there are different versions and redactions of these things. And so it's so easy to just pick and choose what you want to take from these things because it's so messy. Yeah. And so, and that's part of the allure of it. It's so vague and mysterious, where for people like you and me, that draws us in to say like, oh, I want to know more. This is really interesting. And whereas others say like, I'm going to make of this what I want.
Yeah.
And what appeals to me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Perfect. We've been talking an hour and a half.
Jesus.
So let's wrap this up. I'm going to call you Zach because I know you said before there's not a young man called Zachary. You're not that old yet. So Zach, thank you very much for joining me. Is there anything you want to plug, shout out, where people can read your work or papers?
I think I have an academia.edu thing. I have a couple articles coming out soon. One on the suffrage movement from the U.S. and their use of Old Norse mythology, and another one on the Northmen that should come out next year. And I just want to give a shout out to to my Ranis funded project Kvinnesspor. We didn't get a chance to talk about that, but with the travel narratives of women visiting Iceland, it's been a lot of fun to do. And there will be some a website coming up soon if anybody's interested in travel writing and Iceland. And we're focusing on women who traveled to where the sagas took place and what they talked about and landscape and that sort of thing. That should be coming up. And you can follow me, I guess, on whatever platform there is. It's called Zachary Melton is my handle. So if you're interested, but like, I don't post a lot about what I research. It's a lot of like basketball takeaways.
That's cool, though. No, we can do a whole other episode on that. So don't worry.
Okay,
we will get a chance to talk about all that. Don't worry. Okay, if you want to follow me directly, it's Daniel_Farrand1 on Instagram. I post a bunch of little videos teaching people about different things that I go and visit. I just did one on the Doomsday Book, so that was quite cool. Obviously the business at Horns of Odin, and if you can support the podcast, literally, we have a Facebook group you can join where you get updates. It's just Nordic Mythology Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and obviously the Patreon. If you can, it's £3 a month, and it really does help us keep going. So yeah, let's jump over and do a quick Q&A.